At one point or another, everybody has a first garden. A lot of people get the bug maybe when they go to a nursery and see some plants they like and figure it's time to start. Whoa, just hold on a minute. Before you plant anything, we have a checklist for you before you start your first garden of things you ought to consider. Consider this your first garden checklist. Debbie Flower is here, and here we are in Debbie Flower's garden. And even though, Debbie, you're an accomplished gardener, a retired college horticultural professor. By the way, America's favorite retired college horticulture professor. We should point out that anytime you move to a new house, it's a new challenge. It's a new garden. And it's kind of hard to tell gardeners this, but one piece of advice is live with the yard for a year and notice where the sun is.
Absolutely. Living with the yard for a year is very difficult to do, but it is worth doing. And I've had many gardens. And I can't say that I have the patience that would allow you to live with the garden for a year. So
Well, there's pots. Have you heard of smart pots?
There are pots, yes. And then there are annuals. And so going out with sunflower seeds in the summer or just trying things and making sure they get enough water and seeing what happens is what you can do during that first year when you need to see where the sun is in the middle of winter, in the middle of summer, in spring, Marchish, and in fall.
Yeah, one thing we did when we moved to the new house 6 years ago is we lived with it for a year. We planted in pots temporarily, and I took pictures of the yard at 4 different times of the year throughout the day. So it's like once a month, every 4 months, every 3 months or so, I'd take a picture. I'd take a picture at 9 a.m., at noon, 3 p.m. and 6 p.m., just so I would remember where the shadows are, where the shade is, because all the neighbors had trees. And I wanted to know definitely which of those areas are going to get 6 to 8 hours or more of sun a day. Turns out not many.
Yes, and then you convinced your neighbor to remove some of those trees, which, by taking those pictures, you knew what needed to go. Pictures are wonderful. Pictures are... Not only do they inform you of sun and shade, but they show you how your yard is changing over time and what wonderful things you've done to it.
And that's the other thing, too, to consider, even if it's not your first garden, is plants grow and there are new areas of shade. So if you're going to be putting in plants that require full sun, you have to stay aware that the area that was full sun 5 years ago may not be full sun now. I guess when we're talking about planting a first garden, we should get a little bit more specific. Are we talking a flower garden, an herb garden, a vegetable garden? I guess with a vegetable garden, one thing you should make note of is what does your family enjoy eating? And no, there are no French fry plants.
Yes, I have a vegetable bed, one raised bed and some in-the-ground area that I use for growing vegetables. And my production of vegetables has decreased over time because of the things my family will not eat. So why should I grow them if nobody's going to eat them? I have neighbors who I can give some stuff to, but I remember showing up at one neighbor's house with some tomatoes, and she said, I'm not going to eat all your leftover tomatoes this summer. I said, okay, fine. Well, do you want these? She took those, but we never took any back. So the garden has gotten smaller. And at times I've thought about just converting it to annual flowers so that I could have bouquets of flowers. I mentioned that to a horticulture friend, and she said, as long as you have a good farmer's market nearby. So yes, you do need to decide what you're going to grow, what's going to make you happy, and look for those sun shade conditions. 6 to 8 hours of full sun for those flowers or those vegetables is definitely desirable. And I, in fact, had to move my raised bed this year because tree got bigger and it started shading the bed, and I wasn't getting enough sun for production.
Another thing that beginning gardeners tend to do is, their eyes are bigger than their tummy. And when it comes to planting, they'll put in way too much. Those suggestions on the back of seed packets and that come with 6 packs of plants as far as spacing of plants, that's actually pretty good advice.
It is. And if you're looking at landscape plants rather than annuals or things you're going to grow from seed, you need to look at the size the plant is going to be when it's mature. That's typically on the tag. If not, you're going to have to look the plant up and find out how tall and wide it's going to become. Sometimes you only learn how tall it's going to become, then you assume it will be equally as wide, and then space them in the garden so that they will, at maturity, not run into each other. Maybe they'll touch. That's what you have to decide, where your path is going to be. Where do you want to be able to walk between the plants? Where can the plants touch? But you need to give them enough space to get big enough.
Exactly.
A friend of mine is a landscape architect, and I asked her when I was teaching if there was one thing she could say to people when they are planting their gardens or yards, what would it be? And her number one thing was space the plants far enough apart. More problems are created by them being too close together than anything else. And I'm guilty of that as well, planting too close together, because it's so easy to do. When you buy them, they're so small and cute and they look so pretty together. And having these wide spaces between them doesn't make a lot of sense. But space them for their health and for the future of your garden.
And not only is it healthier for the plant, it also can keep bad pests and diseases away as well, because when you cut down air circulation by planting too close together, especially if you live in an area of high humidity, you could have all sorts of disease issues that could be mitigated by allowing air to circulate freely through those plants.
Absolutely true. Yes.
And when you're walking around your yard figuring out what you want to plant and where you want to put it, go inside the house and look out the windows. And think about where you spend most of your time indoors and which windows you're going to be looking out. And think about what you want to stare at for the rest of your life out those windows. And especially if you have a kitchen window, the vegetable garden, the fruit trees, the food products should be within easy view of that kitchen window.
Yes, when I initially laid the hardscape in this landscape we're sitting in right now, the landscaper suggested putting the vegetable garden in a place I would not see it from the patio or any window. And I said, no, I have to be able to see it on a regular basis, so I tend it.
Keep that in mind, too, when you're planting the garden. Do some sitting inside and look out and think about what you want to see that's out there. And remember that taller plants closer to your window may block the view of whatever's behind it. So if you want a complete view of the yard, if you're going to put in those trees or those shrubs, you may want to stick those further out so you can see the rest of your garden. Or if you're trying to protect some privacy, then you would want those taller plants closer to the window.
Or you can create rooms and create a space that where you see, it makes your landscape feel bigger. If you create where you can only see a small area and then you have to walk around a plant to see the next area in your garden. Lots of different ways. I love the looking out the window idea as a way to design the garden. I don't necessarily want to see my neighbor's house when I look outside the window. And so I've done lots of view blocking by planting trees and evergreen shrubs in places that will block those views.
When you're planting your garden, one thing to keep in mind is, where's the water faucet? How big of a chore is it going to be to water that garden? And this is where planning may require some pencil and paper, because you may want to lay out an irrigation system, perhaps even a drip irrigation system.
You may want that, and in our dry California climate, that's almost a must. But I've lived in places that get rain year-round, and in that case, we just needed to be near a hose bib. But we still needed to be near that hose bib instead of dragging it, 50 feet across from the back of the garage over to the vegetable garden. So having that in place is critical.
Exactly. So plan on installing a permanent irrigation system so that the water controls are as close to the garden as possible. Or if you're putting in an entire irrigation system for the whole yard, consider valves that are dedicated to the vegetables that you can put on different timers as opposed to if you have a lawn.
Lawns are some of the highest water users in the landscape. So many things can survive with much less water than that. Even in our climate here that is dry, definitely from May through October, I don't water most of my landscape more than once every 2 weeks or so. Lawns, especially lawns that are mowed, need to be watered more frequently than that. Grass needs more water. So you don't want everything on the same watering regime.
Well, to plant a garden, you need soil, and if you're not doing it in pots, if you're doing it in the ground, and you haven't planted a garden in your yard before, what are some first steps you should take?
Well, sometimes if you move into a place like we did here that was empty for 2 years because it was back when mortgages were in trouble in 08-ish, the landscape has not been maintained and it's full of weeds. So the first thing to do is clear those weeds away.
Clear the weeds away. And there is debate now about rototilling soil.
Yeah.
And I could justify rototilling once initially to put in some compost. But if you don't want to do that, well, one easy way to improve your soil is through sheet mulching.
Yeah, sheet mulching. I did that at my mother's house. She wanted to add some perennials around her. She had a light on a post in the yard near the driveway. And so one time I went out and laid down a bunch of newspaper, takes several layers. Newspaper is now made with soy ink. And so you use the dull pages not the shiny ones. They may have other chemicals in them you don't want in your soil, but the dull newspaper, several layers, 5, 6 layers, lay it down in the fall. I put mulch over it, bark mulch over the top, leaf mulch, whatever I could find, and then let it sit. And by spring, you will have smothered those weeds and you can plant into it.
And you've improved the soil as well.
Right, correct.
Another thing to watch in that first year before you plant is where does the water go when it rains? Are there muddy areas that seem to persist for days after a storm? Those areas should probably get marked off. It could be as simple as taking a T-post or a stake and just stick it in that perennial muddy area. Most plants that are desirable don't like muddy soil. So in those areas, you may want to consider raised beds or planting in pots.
Absolutely. I have a spot like that in this yard, and I put the vegetable garden, the raised bed near there, covering part of that spot. Part of it I just don't use in the winter when we get our rains here in California.
For that person starting a garden for the first time, I would kind of shy away from recommending starting from seed, unless the plant typically grows from seed, and just go to the nursery and get yourself a 6-pack, a 4-pack, gallon plant, a 5 or a 15-gallon container. But what are some easy confidence-building plants to put in as far as annuals go, perennials, and vegetables?
Well, annuals are plants that complete their life cycle in 1 year. Often it's a portion of 1 year, let's say from spring through summer, and it goes to seed and dies in the fall. That's a great time to garden, especially with kids. And with kids, big seeds are very desirable because they can handle them well, and they can see the results of those plants that come up quickly. And so sunflowers are one wonderful one, easy to start from seed. Zinnias are another one that's easy to start from seed. Not such big seeds, though. There are beans that you can grow from seed. They can be bush beans that you're going to get an edible crop from, or they can be a vining scarlet runner bean, which does give an edible crop, but I often grow it just for the beautiful red flowers it produces. And I did some research on it back when my kids were in a daycare and found that at that time, in the late 80s anyway, the research said that a kid could eat the entire plant and not get sick. So it's a great thing to have around little ones as well.
Perennials are plants that you can expect to last for more than a year.
Right. And then the trick I think about perennials is planting them at the right time. Nurseries will have them when they're in flower, and I would prefer to buy them when they're not in flower and put them in the fall. There are perennials that bloom in the fall, but there are a lot of perennials bloom in the spring and the summer, and I would prefer to plant them when they're out of flower. They root better that way.
When it comes to planting vegetables, some of the easier ones to grow include greens, such as lettuce. But the trick with things like lettuce is what climate do you live in? If you live in a hot climate, those lettuces and some spinaches and other of those leafy greens that you may enjoy do best in the cool season, planted between September and February, March. If it's the warm season, you could switch to some other heat-loving plants that are easy to grow, perhaps tomatoes or peppers.
Right. Cucumbers are also pretty easy to grow from seed, and another big seed. But all of these things we're talking about need that 6 to 8 hours of sun, except maybe the greens. If you have no bright sun, or if the spots of bright sun move around, a couple things to consider. One is put the plants in a pot and put the pot on wheels and move it around from sunny space to sunny space. That's a whole lot of labor, by the way. The other is to grow things where you eat the leaves, like the lettuces and greens.
How do you feel about mulch?
You can see my yard is full of mulch. That's one of the reasons I can do that watering so infrequently, is I have organic mulch on top of this soil, and that breaks down with the help of naturally existing organisms. And the what's left, the broken down organic matter, is what holds water in the soil. And that helps the plants to have an even water, even though I'm only applying it once every 2 weeks or so. The roots are getting it over a much longer period of time. I wouldn't use the same arborist mulch in my vegetable garden that I would use on my landscape, but you can buy compost, or you can make your own compost, something that is a little finer, not so much wood in the product.
Exactly. Yeah. You save the arborist clippings for your hardwood plants and then use worm castings or compost for your soft-bodied plants.
Right.
The one thing we haven't talked about, and this should be part of your first garden checklist, is how much time are you willing to devote to taking care of it? Because just like raising a family, it's all about maintenance.
Yes, it really is. I like to walk my landscape every day, and I have paths. You need to set up paths when you create a garden so that you can get around and check on things. And the number one thing I do is weed, but often I need to prune something that's growing out into the path. Look for those pests, see what's flowering, see what needs to be harvested. You can't know what to do in the garden if you don't visit it on a regular basis.
Smart gardeners have multiple pairs of pruning shears that they hide throughout the garden in like old mailboxes or some sort of structure to protect them from the elements, which isn't a bad idea because as you learn to enjoy gardening, you will always have a pair of pruning shears with you.
Yes, I have them in my car, I have them in the kitchen, I have them in the garage, and I often have one in my back pocket.
One thing you notice as you become familiar with your garden, you're going to find out when your plant is healthy and when it's not healthy just by observing. And that's something you've said a lot on this podcast is get out there and spend time with your plants.
That's right. Get to know them, enjoy them, and visit them so you know when things are starting to go wrong. It's so much easier to control a problem at the beginning when it starts to happen than waiting until it gets much bigger. And the number one example of that is weeds. Weeds are much easier to control when they're small, but if you let them flower and produce seed, then you've just increased the problem.
Attack weeds early. And by the way, one helpful hint that a lot of experienced gardeners follow is they realize while they're having their morning coffee, I need to get out in the yard and do such and such today. Write it down, put it in your pocket, because when you go outside, you're going to find other things. And before you know it, 4 hours have gone by and you're going to ask yourself, now, why did I come out here originally?
That is so true. I use my filing system is my pants pockets, but that is so true. I do write them down with the chores that I think need to be done. I've been known to wake up in the middle of the night and write things down because for whatever reason, it's going through my head. So yes, and you do. It's like there are jokes about people going into one room to do something and never doing it because they find something else to do. The garden is just the same way.
Debbie Flower, great to be in your garden. Thank you.
I'm glad you're enjoying it. My pleasure.